Hi, I'm Derek Sanker, the Community and Inclusion Coordinator for Breaking Down Barriers, and welcome to this otherwise micro-learning session. And this time we're going to be looking at unconscious bias and neurology. Unconscious bias is a natural and very essential part of how our brains work, and I'll give you a quick whistle-stop tour of how and why it happens. The less we recognise it in action, the more it influences all of our decisions. It helps us to feel like we belong to a group or a community, and it can also help us to feel like we don't belong to a group or community, to feel excluded, different, or other. And that's where that term othering comes from. We'll also touch on taking responsibility for reducing the impact of our bias. And most importantly, we'll briefly look at how we can use unconscious bias to make others feel welcome and safe. So I'm not doing ground rules with these micro sessions, and I would do with face-to-face training and online training. But I do want to have a quick word about the difference between discomfort and danger or feeling unsafe. And it's partly because we can be so unused to feeling discomfort that we immediately jump to it's feeling unsafe for me. And the difference is danger really is a call to act immediately for our own safety. It's that thing that makes us jump out of the way of a bus or move our hands really quickly away from something hot. And discomfort is a sign that something needs to change. There's a bodily response and our cognitive brain has time to make a choice. So it's a call for us to consider and decide how we want to proceed. So my invitation is for some of you, if there's a sense of discomfort in the session, to stay with it and see how it changes. Of course, we all want to feel safe and comfortable, but those places of discomfort are often the place where our patterns, the way we've done things in the past, are being challenged. And we're just stepping into a new way of doing things. That's a place of growth and change. So yeah, the invitation is to stay with the discomfort if at any time you feel it. So the quick tour of the neurobiology. Our brains are processing 11 gigabytes per second. That's 11 million bytes of information per second. And we are only consciously aware of up to 40 bytes. And that's when we're at our best, when we're awake and paying attention. And you can imagine how that compares to your laptop or your computer that you're working on now. Of all of that information, only 2% of emotional cognition is available to us consciously. So all that stuff gets packed away and stored in our unconscious. It picks up everything, our unconscious picks up the 11 gigabytes per second of information, tucks it away. The process of othering occurs in that unconscious part of our mind. That's the unconscious bias bit. This can lead to racism, sexism, disability and other biases. To understand how our brains process all that information or store all of that information, I'll give you a really simplified explanation. And we can think of the brain as being divided into parts, and fast brain and slow brain is one of the ways it's often described. You may have heard the description of lizard brain or reptilian brain, and that's the amygdala part. That's the fast brain. It takes very little, it needs very little oxygen, very little glucose for it to work. It kicks in immediately, processes things really quickly. And the slow brain is the cognitive side of our brain. That takes far more oxygen and glucose for us to do all that rational thinking. So that reptilian brain, it's responsible for our survival and for instincts. It's the fight and flight, freeze or fawn responses that can kick in before our rational brain knows what's happening. And also, in order to make those really quick decisions, it has to learn stuff. It's the part of our brain that instantly knows that 2 times 2 is 4. It's the part of our brain that we use when we're driving on a clear road, and we're kind of switching off from what we're doing in our bodies, and our mind just takes over the driving. It's the autopilot that we use often. It's the bit that picks up words and images as we're driving along, and it picks up the words and images on the advertising boards at the side of the road. Yeah, the autopilot. It also includes, that's fast brain, also includes a limbic system, which holds our emotions and memories and habits. So a lot of our decision making happens in this fast brain part, the emotional, the memories, the habitual part of our brain. The rational thinking part, as I said, it's the slow brain. It takes a lot of oxygen and glucose for it to start working and to reason clearly. It's a bit that's capable of abstract thought, of language, of rational thinking. I think the word is neocortex. That's the part of it. And it's the bit when people say, slow down, take a breath. That's exactly what we're doing. We're allowing enough oxygen and glucose to reach that part of the brain for it to kick in. So in order to process all this information, all those millions of bytes of information, the fast brain, the lizard brain, does a range of things. First of all, it begins to group or categorize information. So if we were to eat a berry, a red berry, and that was poisonous, it made us feel sick, it will suddenly begin to feel an aversion to anything that's kind of red berry looking like. So it will group all red berries as potentially dangerous. It creates associations between things as well. And one of the things our brains is incredibly good at is filling in missing information. We create stories to fill in those gaps of information. And so these stories, or schema, are influenced by social interactions. The lizard brain absorbs messages from the external world, significant adults, close friends, the media. If we trust or believe the source, then the story is added to our picture of how the world is. And this is all to enable us to make rapid decisions. Of course, this also leaves us open to picking up negative bias and stereotypes. Priya Agrawal, in her book Sway, says that from as early as 4 years old, children become aware of racial differences and hold both positive and negative views. And by the time they're 12, those views have become firmly established. So it's not just our neurology. We pick up not only do we soak in what's said around us and what we witness, but we soak in the body language, the non-verbal communication that can still give a sense of negative or positive bias. And we will do a further session on microaggressions fairly soon. That's that non-verbal communication, negative non-verbal communication. And in particular, we'll look at how the impact of a small, tiny microaggression, even when it's often unintended and unrealized, but it can still have a huge impact on the person receiving it or witnessing it. That session will come fairly soon. And that the fact that it is body language, it's non-verbal stuff that can also help us create bias and those negative stories about certain outgroups, has been described by Greg Willard as non-verbal contagion, that idea that we soak it in from people around us. And it is almost impossible to grow up without forming both positive and negative bias towards different groups of people. Even if we think that bias is wrong, it still lodges in the unconscious. And as I said before, children recognise really early on, from the age of 4, we recognise the difference in skin colours, and it only turns into prejudice if our surroundings reinforce those perceptions. But of course, we are constantly surrounded by negative messages about outgroups, both on TV and films, in news reports and social media, etc. So racial bias is expressed through these subtle non-verbal behaviours, and we can passively catch it through observation, through witnessing other people, incidents. Yeah, so when we witness this and pick it up, soak in that non-verbal contagion. The good news is that it does work both ways. So as well as soaking in microaggressions, we can soak in positive incidents, so micro-affirmations. So we can actively ensure that our behaviour, what we're doing, influences observers and witnesses to be more accepting of outgroups and other groups. So I want to talk about a few forms of unconscious bias. And these are some of the reasons why our unconscious create the bias. And I'll start with affinity bias. And this is that idea that we're drawn to people who share qualities, the same qualities that we do, or qualities that we like and admire. So we tend to favour those people. It occurs because our brain sees them as familiar and relatable. And then there's negativity bias. And that's that we focus much more on negative events. We remember negative events far more than we do positive ones. And the really simple reason is, as we were evolving, it was essential that we remembered the foods that were dangerous, that harmed us, the berries that harmed us, the animals that were dangerous. So they became firmly lodged in our minds. And actually that's partly why when we're giving feedback, negative feedback to someone, we often say we should sandwich it with positive feedback. And the reality is, or research has suggested that it takes 5 positive statements to balance out the impact of 1 negative statement. The next form of unconscious bias is conformity bias. That's the idea that we all seek acceptance from each other. So our views can be swayed by the sense of wanting to belong to the majority group, and so agreeing with the majority group. And the last one that I want to talk about is confirmation bias. And this has a particular impact on social media. It's the idea that we look, when we're listening to new information, we're searching for bits of evidence that back up our opinions, the opinions that we already have, rather than looking at that whole picture. And in social media, this works by, it's the fact that we kind of tend to like the people and the news outlets that already reinforce the opinions that we already have. And then by only listening to them, it begins to magnify and balloon out. So micro-affirmations. What are the things that we can do in our working lives to help create or help people witnessing soak in that positive aspect of groups who have been excluded in the wider world? And it's relatively simple, and I'm sure if you're already in the supporting services, as most of us are, watching this video, or servicing industries, or I guess sales industries as well, you're probably doing a lot of this already. So we're talking about things like active listening, so being really present, paying attention, reflecting things that are said to the person speaking, and that overlaps greatly with body language. So positive body language, making sure that we're smiling, eye contact, and with sensitivity, remembering that there are some cultures where eye contact is a sign of disrespect. So they may be averting eyes, looking down while talking to you as a sign of respect. And it's easy, if you're used to eye contact as being respectful, to interpret that as to interpret them as being disrespectful, or perhaps holding back, or sometimes because they're not making eye contact, being shifty or lying. And so it's really important to remember the cultural context around eye contact and a few of these other body language things. Nodding, making sure that we're not kind of seated or facing them with our arms folded, but in a more open posture. Giving appropriate personal space, and again, that's another one that's kind of fairly culturally influenced. And I just want to say as well that if it's okay if you find someone is kind of encroaching on your own personal space, and it may not be that they're trying to do that deliberately. It may be that they have a very different sense of how close is acceptable or how close is comfortable. So it's okay for you to say to someone else that it's a little bit close, and to ask them to politely ask them to move back a bit. Praise and acknowledgement, giving credit publicly, is incredibly important. So when someone comes up with a good idea, praising and giving credit, but it's really important not just to say, well done, that's a great job, not to be general. Really important to be really specific about the reasons why you're giving praise. And so the difference is, what I mean by that is, instead of saying, well done, you've done a really good job there, to say, well done, that's a great report, and I particularly like how concise and clear you are, and the bullet points at the end, the action points that you've come up with, whatever it is, be really as clear as you possibly can. And that's because if you keep your praise general, then the next time something happens and you say, actually that's not quite good enough, you need to do this and this better, you're not negating the previous praise. And if you had just said, so if the previous praise was general, then the next time something isn't quite as good, you end up negating that general praise. If the previous praise is specific, then the next time something goes wrong, they still hold on to the job that they did really well. And then there's something around amplifying things that other people do well, or amplifying ideas that are suggested by other people. And in the Obama cabinet, this was something that was done by the women in the Obama cabinet. And whenever something was suggested, or a good idea was suggested by one of the women in the cabinet, another woman would repeat that suggestion and name and credit the woman who made that suggestion. So it's heard twice, and the person saying it is noted twice. So that kind of amplification, and we can do that with all communities who are excluded in the wider world, in the wider society. And there's really simple things like pronouncing names properly and using them often, and being heard to use names and pronounce them properly is really important. And that's an act of making people who people who are excluded and often excluded much more visible. And for the same reasons, it's really important to use correct pronouns, and not to assume pronouns, but because if we assume wrongly, we're actually adding to that, to the microaggressions. So it's a simple thing to ask for pronouns, and then the act of simply asking for someone's pronouns, what we're doing is not only saying to the person we're asking, but everyone who's witnessing, everyone who's hearing that question, that we have some understanding of the importance of pronouns for some communities, and so it makes it slightly safer for someone to say, actually, these are my preferred pronouns, this is how I identify, this is how I'd like you to address me when you're talking to me. So we've come to the end of this particular otherwise micro-learning session. And I'm kind of curious to see if you have questions, if there's anything in this session that needs to be clarified, and I can update the session or I can add new sessions. How have you found this session? Has it been useful? Has it covered things that you already know? Any feedback, positive and negative, is really, really welcome. And again, being specific rather than general is really important. And it'd be great to know if there's anything that you want us to cover in the future. So thank you for watching this otherwise micro session. The feedback link is at the bottom of the text under this video, and I do really appreciate any feedback you want to give. And look out for the new ones coming soon.